my initial thought when I was diagnosed is, this is a punishment for the way I've been living. And so I remember praying that night, like, I'll stop sinning. I'll read my Bible. Just don't let this take my life.
Welcome to Religion Sucks, a podcast where we talk about what it's like to have a real relationship with God. My name's Rich, and I'm here with my co-host Kirsten. Today, our guest is Garrett Reimer. Garrett was 15 years old and a freshman in high school when he was diagnosed with a rare form of spinal cord cancer. Faced with a 9-hour surgery, months of treatment, and an uncertain future, he discovered what faith actually looks like when religion stops working and you need God to be real. Garrett's story challenges every easy answer we give about suffering, and it shows us what happens when everything else gets stripped away. So Garrett joins us to talk about what he lost and what he gained through his cancer journey and where he's headed now.
Welcome, Garrett. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. I'm glad we could finally find a time to sit down and record this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, we always start by asking people the same question.
Yep.
What is your earliest memory of God or your earliest experience with religion?
Yeah. It's hard to pinpoint. I have been going to church my whole life. And so I think to a degree he's kind of been present for as long as I have memory. But if I were to pinpoint one specific time, it would probably be at Camp Idra Haji, which I think you've been to. And
what does Idra Haji stand for?
Idra Haji stands for,
yes.
It stands for I'd Rather Have Jesus. And it's a Christian summer camp here in Colorado. And I was probably, 8 years old when this happened. And it was at I think it used to be called Teepee Camp, but now it is Wilderness Ridge. And it was just the first time, at least in my memory, that I had been presented with the gospel in a way that an 8-year-old could digest it. And that was also the first time that I at least said the words of making a profession of faith in Christ. Looking back, I think I was probably just too young to grasp what that meant. But I would say that is the moment that I can pinpoint where I would say that my faith journey started.
Nice.
Yeah.
So it wasn't enough to give up cigarettes and drinking
well,
and everything
no,
yet, but
that
came later. Right?
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. That's great.
Well, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit of your story. Maybe give us just a kind of a brief overview of your childhood from 30,000 feet.
Okay.
What was life like for you growing up?
Totally. Well, yeah. Rolling it all the way back to, I was born in Salt Lake City, Utah. That was where I was born. No, I am not Mormon. Never was. But I moved here to Colorado when I was 6. And we continued to attend church. I would go to Sunday school. And that was, at that age, more of a daycare than it was, spiritually enriching. But I, grew up going to church, fairly normal childhood. Went through public schools and kind of got into just really heavily into academics and played a few sports through elementary school and middle school, as much as an elementary schooler and a middle schooler can be invested in any one thing. And then really where my faith started to be challenged was in my freshman year. And that actually, I guess I will backpedal to 8th grade a little bit. And I would bike to school a lot in 8th grade. It was actually faster than driving because of the traffic. And in May of my 8th grade year, I was just biking to school as I normally did. And it had rained the previous night. So the roads were a little slick. And I came around a corner too fast and my tires came out from underneath me and I broke my right humerus. So the upper portion of your right arm. And
not a funny bone.
Not a funny bone, especially not when it's broken. So my mom came and scooped me up and took me to the ER. And they put me into what was, I think they call it a hanging cast. And I was just in a cast for 3 weeks. I didn't even have to have surgery. It was fairly straightforward. And then when I came out of that cast, my arm was unsurprisingly weak from not having used it for 3 weeks. The bone had healed just fine. They took another x-ray and that looked good. And then I started physical therapy to start, regenerating that strength that I had lost when my arm was, not being used in the cast. And that physical therapy continued for about a month or two, and we just weren't seeing any progress with my right arm. Again, the bone had healed just fine, but I couldn't regain that muscle strength. I couldn't lift my right arm above my head, and my physical therapist was really confused about this. He said, "It's been 2 months. You should have healed by now." And so he referred me back to those physicians that I saw the day of the crash, and they were also very confused about what was going on. So they ordered just a whole slew of medical tests, and it ended up dragging out about, 5 or so months of MRIs to see if my rotator cuff was torn and different physical exams. And it ended up culminating with this test called an EMG, electromyograph. It was not a fun test. It involves these shocks and these needles to basically test the function of your nerves, in my case, in my right arm and shoulder. And what they found is that I actually had nerve damage that was preventing my arm from healing, and that's why those muscles weren't growing back. And they pinpointed with that test that the nerve damage was in my neck. So we were all very confused about that. I ended up going to Children's Hospital for an MRI about a month later. So by now it was December of the same year. So a pretty good amount of time has passed. And in that MRI, I was actually diagnosed with cancer. They found a tumor in my spinal cord that was actually blocking those nerve signals from getting from my brain to my spinal cord. The specific diagnosis was called pilocytic astrocytoma, and that was December 23rd of 2021. So I was 15 years old, and that unsurprisingly rocked my world. Spinal cord cancer is a very rare cancer. It is dangerous to operate on, and obviously there's just not a lot of flexibility in that part of the body. A lot of really crucial nerves that innervate your heart and your lungs and all of your organs and really everything south of the neck. And so that was a very shocking diagnosis. We were not at all expecting that.
Do you remember what the feelings you were experiencing?
I mean, had a lot of feelings running through my head. I think the first emotion was just shock. I think up until that point, I had just assumed maybe I hadn't been doing my physical therapy exercises enough, and that was really all it was. And so none of us were expecting a diagnosis as severe as cancer. And of course, a lot of this turned into questions, approaching God with, where is this coming from? Why would you allow this to happen? And I'm sure we'll get into more of that conversation. But yeah, initially just shocked at this is really a serious and life-threatening diagnosis. And there were so many questions we were grappling with about where do we go forward from this? Are we going to do chemotherapy? Is there going to be surgery involved? What does my outcome look like? Is my life in jeopardy? So very, very serious questions to be grappling with.
I would say. I mean, most 15-year-olds are worried about getting their driver's license or making varsity. You were just told you might die.
Seriously, yeah.
So what happened next then? I mean, what path did you go down for treatment?
Yeah. So from a medical standpoint, the first line of treatment that they wanted to take was surgery, and they wanted their best neurosurgeon on the case because the spinal cord is just such a dangerous area to operate. There's not a lot of room to work with, and if you snip the wrong nerve, that could be the one that innervated your heart or your lungs. So we also explored a couple different other cancer centers and ultimately decided to stay here in Colorado with Children's Hospital because they seemed very comfortable doing this procedure, very well trained, and they're a pretty renowned cancer center. So we ended up staying here. My surgery was actually 3 weeks after my diagnosis. That was the soonest availability they had to do the operation. And we knew the risks of the surgery going into it. There was a very real chance that I could have vocal paralysis, that even, though unlikely, that I could not wake up from that surgery. And so that, just preparing for that surgery mentally was a really difficult time, especially having 3 weeks to grapple with that.
You were only 15, but what did that look like for you? How do you process that as a 15-year-old?
I think part of it was delayed because we were waiting until we got results back from another MRI to see if if the cancer had spread to my brain, and thankfully it had not. And so part of it was just waiting to see what would happen if they were going to operate. And so for a couple of those weeks, it was just completely not knowing what was on the other side of that curtain, and kind of whether I wanted to or not, just trusting the Lord with it, which was really the first time that I'd experienced that in my life. And then also just thinking about a lot of the relationships in my life. And ultimately, the night before that surgery, I did have to reach out to a lot of people and say, hey, I don't know what's going to happen with the surgery and what things are going to look like on the other side. But I just, had to have that conversation with them about, I'm grateful for our relationship, and, whether that's grandparents, family, friends, and just also telling a lot of the friends and extended family in my life what was going on. And that was a very intimidating conversation to have with somebody.
What were people's responses like?
Oh, they varied drastically. I had, I would say the most common one is just, I'm sorry, I'm shocked. Nobody expected it. I had a lot of close friends just really come around me during that time. It was around that time that I was getting plugged in with Calvary Church in Inglewood, and they really came around me as a church and supported me. And then I had other people who just didn't know how to respond. I mean, it's a very difficult thing, especially as a 15-year-old or as a friend of a 15-year-old, to know how to respond to. And so I had people who would just distance themselves because they didn't want to say the wrong thing. And so it was easier to say nothing at all. And I don't fault them for that. It's extremely difficult to know how to lovingly respond to that kind of news as an adult, much less as a middle schooler or a high schooler.
You're sitting.
Yes, I did survive the surgery.
You survived the surgery.
And not without some misfortune. It was, I actually lost 90% of all neurological function in that surgery based on their monitoring equipment. And then I spent another 3 weeks in the hospital.
In what part of your body?
Just throughout my body.
Just throughout your body,
yeah.
90%.
They have what's called like a neuromonitoring system in surgery to make sure that they are not causing permanent damage. And they pushed it to the very edge of what they can do without causing permanent damage. And they did a great job. They definitely caused some short-term loss of function, loss of sensation. But over the following 3 weeks that I spent in the hospital, I made a full recovery. I did have to learn to walk again. I waited about a week to regain sensation in my feet, which was just a very unexpected and difficult experience. Nothing I ever thought I would walk through. But I had some really amazing people taking care of me at the hospital. I had dozens of letters and cards from people in the church, from friends and family who sent cards and gifts that were literally covering the wall of my hospital room from floor to ceiling. And so that was just wildly encouraging to have just that group of people come around me.
So you have this very long, intense surgery, and then you're in the hospital for 3 weeks. Yes. They release you, you go home. What happens then?
Yeah, so I guess I didn't even say it. They were not able to fully resect the tumor in surgery. It was very ingrained, for the lack of a better word, into the spinal cord, into the fibers, the nerve fibers. And so they resected what they could, safely, and then they left the remainder of it to be treated with chemotherapy. So I had about a month to recover from the initial surgery, and then they started me on a clinical trial for a new kind of chemotherapy that was actually just a pill I took twice a day. It still had a lot of the same side effects as chemotherapy, as we think about different changes with hair, nausea, weight loss, that kind of thing. But I did that for a year, and it actually was able to successfully shrink the tumor, which is not something that we always see with cancers. Typically, they just kind of scar over and become dormant. So that was just extremely, extremely relieving to see that effective of a response. And then for the remainder of my time on treatment, it just remained dormant, which is exactly what they want to see. And they actually pulled me off of treatment a year early. I was supposed to do 2 years of chemotherapy, but after 1 year, they had seen an effective enough response that they pulled me off. And that actually allowed me to have some surgeries in my right arm to repair a lot of the nerve function that was blocked by that tumor. And so I was really blessed to have just a fantastic prognosis. The only really lasting side effect that I have is still a little weakness in my right arm. I still can't lift it above my head. But I said at the beginning of all this that if a weak arm is the only thing that I really walk away from spinal cord cancer with, I got off really easy.
So that year that you were on chemo, I imagine your life didn't look like a normal teenager's life, right? What did cancer take from you that year?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was incredibly stubborn. I had already missed about 3 months of school, and so I didn't want it affecting my grades. I wanted to get back to normal. I had all of these super exciting adventures planned through the summer that were with the scouting troop that I was in. And I did not want cancer to get in the way of any of that. And so it ended up being a huge lesson for me in asking for help. I was very, like I said, stubborn and not wanting to accept help from other people. But at the same time, I still wanted to do these things, whether it was finishing all of my makeup work for the semester or going on these really epic adventures with the scouts. And so it ended up being a big lesson in just letting go of my pride and letting all of these people, especially from the church, kind of come around me and support me and allow me to still do these adventures. My best friend, Jack, actually would, help carry my pack even on these adventures. And I was simultaneously getting really plugged in with the youth group at this church and learning a lot about what it meant to surrender this whole story to Christ and kind of walk closer with him during this all of these questions that I was asking. I did come to the youth group as I was starting chemotherapy with a lot of questions that I had about why this was happening, how do I get through this? And the leaders, as well as just my friends in the youth group, totally came around me and not only just supporting me with, physical needs, but also discipling me and, spiritually leading me through this. And so that was just a really great support network to have while I was on chemotherapy.
What part of that year was the hardest for you? Because I imagine there's different levels. There's the physical suffering, but then there's the emotional toll, social. There's a lot happening.
Was it being a blonde?
A blonde.
You told me earlier.
Yeah, chemotherapy made me
pre-roll
blonde.
here that chemotherapy turned your hair blonde.
Yeah.
It's now dark brown.
What do you have against blondes? Wait a minute.
I would say the hardest part of the whole journey for me was the lifelong diagnoses. Like, I could manage okay with learning that, I would have to learn to walk again or go through a surgery and a recovery for that if it was a short-term loss. But hearing that, my right arm would probably never recover, or that the tumor would always be with me, that it would never fully go away. Those were some of the really difficult ones to grasp, because it wasn't like, I could do a certain number of, physical therapy exercises or, a certain treatment or a surgery to get over that. That was actually something that was going to stick with me for the rest of my life. And instead of getting past it, it was actually something that I was going to have to learn to adapt to having.
Something completely out of your control, which I imagine knowing you
Yes.
as well as we do, that would be hard.
It was so difficult. I think, getting to a deeper level of it, it was very difficult to surrender those aspects of my life that I was trying to control through cancer. And there was a lot of, still wanting to have control over my grades and control over, the activities that I was being a part of, and control over, friendships that I lost because of cancer, and just learning to let go of those and surrender those to the Lord was an ongoing process that I am so grateful for. A lot of the people who kind of came around me and discipled me during that time, who showed me what that looks like in day-to-day life.
Well, a lot of people have to hit rock bottom before they really turn to God and surrender control and all that stuff. Before all this hit, do you mind sharing where you were at with God? And, were you just kind of going through the motions? Was there something real there? Did it change, during this experience?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I look back at faith before cancer, and the word that I would use is sick. I was spiritually very sick. I had my identity wrapped up in things that were not in Christ, that were in this world, whether that was, how well I was doing in school, or whether I had a date to homecoming, or, the friendships that I had. And so, and on top of that, I had made habits of just habitual sinful behavior. I had a lot of really broken relationships in my family. And so, and frankly, I just didn't really desire a relationship with Christ. I didn't desire to read the word. I didn't desire to spend time with God in prayer. And so it was absolutely just going through the motions of, I'm going to go to church with my family on Sunday because that's what we do. And, I'll hear the words that are said, and then kind of just go about my week. And
like most 15-year-olds, probably, honestly.
Like a lot of 55-year-olds. Yeah.
Not that I'm expecting my freshman year of high school to be, exactly a time of spiritual maturity. But yeah, I would say that I just didn't desire a relationship with Christ during that time. And, you were talking about how hitting rock bottom and suffering and experiencing these difficult circumstances is almost a catalyst for faith. And that was absolutely the case in my case. And I think it's an important question to wrestle with. I think in the wake of cancer, it's something that I've wrestled with a lot, just this question of why God allows us to go through suffering. And it's, interestingly enough, throughout the past few months of my life, it's also a question I've had a lot of conversations with non-believers who are also asking. I think it's a really big barrier to faith. They don't. It's difficult to come to terms with this reality of how does a loving God allow suffering, and I think that can be a big barrier for people to approach faith. And I've seen a lot of cases where it's also a catalyst for people to really struggle with faith and to come to God with these questions. And so it's absolutely a question that I have grappled with greatly, both for my own sake and my own relationship with God, and also being able to extend that conversation to other people who are also wrestling with the same question.
This may seem like a weird question, but during, the recovery, the chemo, that whole year, what was your prayer life like? Because I can imagine, most 14, 15-year-olds, we don't have much of a prayer life, probably.
They treat God like a vending machine.
Right. But did you find yourself talking to God? Even if it was just to question him or...
Yeah. I think when I was originally diagnosed, I think there's... Sorry, I have a lot of thoughts on this.
Yeah, it's all right.
I think there's these 3 reasons that we kind of go through the progression of giving for why God allows suffering. And I think the first one that I experienced and that I see a lot, even in the Bible, is when we experience suffering, we want to, we look at that as almost a punishment for our sins, whether that's past sins or current sins. And that was my response. And you see it in the Bible too. I was looking at John 9. When the disciples respond to, when they come upon this blind man, they ask Jesus, "Rabbi, who sinned? Was it the man or his parents that he was born blind?" And so that was my own response was, I knew through going to church what a Christian life was, commanded to look like. And I knew that did not align with my life at all. And that I hadn't even been desiring it. And so my initial thought when I was diagnosed is, this is a punishment for the way I've been living. And so I remember praying.
Heavy.
It was so heavy. And I remember praying, perhaps in some amount of naivety that night, like, God, I'll stop sinning. I'll read my Bible. Just don't let this take my life. And frankly, that's not a prayer that I had, within my own power. That's not a promise that I had the power to keep. So I think that was kind of initially my prayer in response to cancer is, God, I'll change, but don't let this take my life. And it was pleading with the Lord. And that also morphed into questions of, God, why would you allow this to happen? Wondering why the Lord was allowing me to experience this. And with that, God showed me with time that approaching suffering as punishment for sin is not, it's a patently false way of thinking about suffering. And that's what Jesus's response to the disciples was in John 9. He says, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." And we also see it in Jeremiah 31, "For I will forgive their iniquity and their sin I will remember no more." Like, God, how can God punish us for sin that he has promised not to remember? It was during this time that I was learning, okay, suffering isn't, punishment for my sin. Jesus took all of that on the cross and he took it upon himself and he paid the price in full. And so God allowing me to experience the suffering is not me paying the price. I couldn't pay that price. And so now I'm grappling with, okay, if it's not that, what is it? And I think that's when I really started towards looking at the future and silver linings and this idea that God uses suffering to make us more like him and, kind of a steel hardened by the flames of the forge scenario. And I think when this is our mindset, we look back on our suffering that we experienced and we see the ways that he strengthened us through it. We see the good that came out of it. And that's when we start to call it a blessing. And I do believe 100% that God uses suffering as an avenue to make us more to transform us into the image of Christ. I 100% believe that. And the more that I thought about it, the more that I realized that is half of it, but that's not the picture of joy in suffering that we see, in 1 Peter, what does it say? Rejoicing insofar as you share in Christ's suffering, not afterwards. And so I really wanted to get to the bottom of, okay, how do I have joy amidst suffering instead of looking at the blessings that come after it, later in life. And so I just continued to wrestle with this. And that also started to bring out some additional questions of, what if there isn't a happy ending? What what about the cases where, if somebody doesn't survive cancer and they don't have that opportunity to see the blessings that came out of it, or even bigger scale when missionaries or groups of faith, faith groups are persecuted to the point of death, where can you find the silver lining in that? And so that really forced me to wrestle with, okay, what is happening in the moment that allows me to experience this joy amidst suffering that Peter's talking about?
And what did you come up with? I want to know.
I can't say that I have, a full and complete answer, but what I came to is that suffering, it trains us to surrender our pride and just lean on Christ. And of all the things that could have kind of made this click for me, it was actually a Mumford & Sons song lyric. I don't know if you know the song Surrender, but there's a lyric in that song where he says, defeat and surrender always seem the same to me, but what does it matter? They both bring me to my knees.
Oh, that's so good.
And that had me thinking about, okay, what does it mean to be defeated and to surrender? And I think we use those terms a lot referencing war, where defeat is this idea of you're so deprived of the ability to fight that you are forced to relinquish authority. Whereas surrender is this idea where you see your imminent defeat coming and you preemptively relinquish authority.
It's voluntary.
Yeah. And the reason that it was important for me to see these and to grapple with the definitions of surrender and defeat is because God was showing me that we are actively engaged in spiritual warfare. Ephesians 6 says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over the present darkness, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So in other words, we have a very real enemy in the person of Satan who does nothing, or who wants nothing more than to separate us from the love of Christ, and who we are actively engaged in war with daily. And as I grew in hearing the word and being discipled by people, I was learning that there's kind of two ways we can go about fighting this war. And that's either using our resources, our strength, depending on our timeline, all of that, or asking God for his resources, his strength on his timeline to fight that war. And I was learning that our pride, and I was experiencing this myself daily, was, it tells us that we can, fight that war on our own with our own resources based on our own strength. And that's not the case. And when we surrender to Christ, and this is exactly what I was experiencing through this, was when we relinquish authority over to him. 1 Corinthians 15 tells us that we already have the victory, that this war that we're engaged in, he has already won. And so this had me thinking a lot about, okay, what does suffering do here? What is the role that suffering plays in this? And I realized that suffering, at least in the case of cancer for me, it had placed me in this place of spiritual defeat. It completely silenced that voice of pride that wants me to rely on my own resources. And it forced me to say, okay, this is not working. There is no amount of striving and, prayer and reading the word and physical therapy and treatments that can, that I can use to get through this. Forget spiritual disciplines. I can't even get through the next day. And it forced me into this place of just, whether I liked it or not, depending on God and trusting him to provide for the next day, and the next answer, the next diagnosis, the next treatment.
Were there times you wanted to quit?
Of course. And there were times where I had genuinely had no idea what the next diagnosis was, what the next treatment that I would go through was. Going into that surgery, I had no idea if I would even wake up. And so I absolutely wanted to be done with it. But instead, God, almost in an act of mercy, though I didn't know it at the time, allowed me to continue through that knowing what was ahead.
Okay, so I just had a thought. You were talking about your stubbornness,
Yes,
kind of innate
yes.
in your nature, which can be a blessing and a difficulty. I mean, really, like any of our character qualities can be used for good or not. How do you, like, what character qualities do you feel like developed for you during all this? Or how are they changed? Like maybe that stubbornness that could have been a liability now is a strength, you know?
I would say I still absolutely can be very stubborn when it comes to asking for help, to
Oh, I know. Just
yeah,
kidding.
yeah. So sanctification is an ongoing process. I would say that I really struggle to just let go of outcomes and trust them to the Lord. And cancer was almost an act of a manifestation of the Lord's grace, where he was actually teaching me to trust him, and to just surrender the outcome to him, because I had no choice. You know, the outcome of the surgery was going to happen regardless of what I did. But what was so merciful about that was it trained me to let go of the circumstances that I did have control over, and to trust those with the Lord, knowing that he had been faithful with cancer. And if that's something that he can be faithful with, then any other part of my life, whether I have control over it or not, he can be faithful with.
That's so good. Well, as you know, also went through my own cancer journey last year. Just went through, mine was a lot less severe and not quite as intense as your journey there, but there were quite a few people, like you had said earlier, who responded well. There's quite a few people that not so well. A lot of things that were said. Did anyone say anything, trying to be helpful that actually made things worse for you?
Yeah, this can be a really difficult one. I think the phrase "everything happens for a reason" is a difficult one. And I've actually seen people who have completely walked away from the church because so many people responded with that when they went through some really difficult circumstances. And it just wasn't a satisfying answer for them.
Yeah. So the platitudes don't help.
No, I would say that the people who really supported me through and responded well in my experience was the people who, instead of necessarily having some really eloquent thought through response, were just the ones who stayed around, who were, even though my circumstances looked completely different, they still invested in our friendship, or as a family relationship, and they still supported me. They still had those conversations with me.
I've heard that called the ministry of presence.
Yes, just simply being there. And that also turned into an opportunity for me to practice extending grace, where sometimes people would have responses to when I share my diagnosis that were hurtful or insensitive. And that was an opportunity for me to say, okay, if the roles were reversed, I would have no idea how to respond. It's just difficult to know what to say to somebody who's experienced something very difficult. And so now, on the flip side of it, whenever somebody approaches me with a difficult experience, I've learned the power of just not necessarily trying to think through some perfect response, but just saying, I'm sorry, this is difficult. How can I be there for you? And then actually carrying that out and being just in their presence, being with them.
Well, looking back on all this, what would you have missed if you had never had cancer?
That's a long list. I think the biggest thing I would have missed, just going back to the same idea of surrendering. I think I would have continued to go through high school, continuing to go through college and the rest of my life, just wanting to control every outcome, wanting to use it for my own benefit, for my own comfort, wanting to pursue the things of this world instead of just being exposed to the beauty of Christ and his church and his word. And really a lot of that just came from people continually investing in me and pointing me to the Word, I never would have had any of that without having gone through cancer. And like I said, it really trained me to learn what it looks like to just let go and lean on Christ, so that's something that I continually can learn to do daily, even when my circumstances aren't forcing me to, because in my experience, that is the most joyful way to live.
I was like asking the why, like why would someone want to surrender to Christ? Why would somebody want to give up control to what's the greatest benefit from somebody that might be listening to give up control to someone else, like obviously God and through Christ?
I would say the harder that we try to control things, the more that we mess them up. And the harder that we grasp something, the faster it runs away. And ultimately, we do not have those resources, that strength, the self-discipline to source all that we're trying to control and the outcomes that we want. And so it is really a freeing thing, a freeing experience to let go and say, Jesus, have with this what you want. And I've seen it in my own life. I've experienced it, and I've seen it just in the lives of so many others who have given their lives to Christ, that whenever they do surrender anything in their life, and especially their whole life to Christ, he uses that for his glory. And that is the most joyful place we could possibly be.
And the peace.
Yeah.
Because I speak from experience, when you're white knuckling something, you just do not want to let go.
There's no peace there.
Exhausting, yeah. And when you finally relinquish it, you have peace.
Yeah, as a fellow control freak, yeah, I agree wholeheartedly, yes. Man, so how would you say was the greatest way that cancer changed your perspective on life then?
I would say when I was 15, which again, probably a lot of 15-year-olds do this, they live life as if they are the main character and that it's all supposed to be for their benefit, for their story, for their own glory. and cancer showed me that that's not the case. I am not the main character, not in my own story, not in anybody else's story. And that the most joyful life I could possibly live is one where Christ is the main character. And daily I have to remind myself, because my pride constantly wants me to, again, be the main character in my own story. And cancer has just been a powerful reminder that when I do surrender to Christ and let him be the main character in my story, he carries me through it and he uses it for his own glory.
So what is your prognosis today? And what are you doing now with your life? Because you're 19,
Yes, correct? Yes. Woo, that feels weird. So my prognosis from a medical standpoint, I am not officially pronounced cancer-free. They will continue to monitor me for a couple more years. And then once about 5 years since since I came off of treatment have passed, that's kind of when they can pronounce me in remission. That being said, they have continued to monitor the tumor for the now almost 3 years, I think, that I've been off of treatment. And I have not had any change in the tumor, and they do not expect it to grow. So very, very grateful for that. Praise God. And I've also had a lot of growth in my arm. Again, still can't reach it above my arm, above my head, but thanks to some surgeries I had, where they actually unplugged those unhealthy nerves and plugged in some healthy ones, which is fascinating. I was able to regain a lot of function. So that has just been another place where God has just poured his grace on me and allowed me to be functional. Most of what humans do is kind of in the realm at the waist level. We're not typically reaching above our heads a lot. And so that's been very encouraging from a medical standpoint. I am now a student at CU Boulder. I'm studying integrative physiology and kind of along that pre-med track. And the goal for me is to go to medical school. I had the opportunity to go on a medical missions trip this summer and just got just a little foretaste of what that looks like to be using medicine as an avenue to share the gospel. And it was just a life-changing experience and something that I want to do with the rest of my life. And so that's the goal. It's a lot of school. I'm going to have to keep my head in the books for a good little while still. But I know that the Lord will provide the strength and the discipline to do that for the next 7+ years, if that's his will. And man, I just pray that I get the opportunity to do medical missions full time.
Well, somebody's listening right now who's in their own dark valley. Maybe it's cancer, maybe it's something else that's just crushing them. Maybe they're wondering where God is. What would you tell them? And not the churchy answer, the real one.
I would start by saying, bring your questions to God, even the hard ones, even the ones where you're questioning if he's there, even the ones where you're questioning if he's good. We see that in Job. We see that in Lamentations, that God actually welcomes that as a form of worship. Second, I would say, know that your suffering, whatever you're experiencing, is not a consequence or a punishment for your sin. It is a opportunity for God to just pour his grace upon you and to learn to surrender to him. And third, I'd say to do exactly that, to trust him with whatever these circumstances are, knowing that he is faithful, that he is good, and he wants to use this to grow in relationship with you, to pour his love on you, to give you his strength, to give you his love. And he will do that. That is a prayer that he loves to answer.
Well, thank you. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you guys.
This is so fascinating. So good to hear your story. And thank you to our faithful listeners for staying with us to the end of the show.
If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We love it when you guys reach out to us. So hit us up on Instagram or contact us through our website, religionsucks.co.
Can't wait to spend time with you guys again next time.